Chapter 1996. She knew that she didn't want to lose him, so she was willing to explain and admit her mistake. Yi Muyun lowered his head and looked at the soft little girl. This was the first time she showed that she cared about him. Although she didn't say it directly, that was what she meant. His heart softened and he rubbed her hair. Let's stay like this for a while. Cher pursed her lips and didn't continue begging. There were only two paths in front of her. One was to continue to quarrel with him, which would result in her not having freedom. The other was to break up. Break up was a strange word to her. Her heart was very complicated. Yi Muyun was very naturally in her world, and she had never thought of asking him to back out. So she begged him. He seemed to have given in, so she didn't resist anymore. After everything calmed down, she seemed to have become an obedient child again. Yi Muyun rubbed her hair and carried her out. I'll walk by myself. Cher struggled for a while, but Yi Muyun didn't let go. He patted her. Behave yourself, I'm a little tired now. He was still hugging her when he was tired. Her voice was filled with complaints. Yi Muyun looked at her and smiled faintly. His smile was like a spring breeze. It blinded Gu Mei's eyes. She looked at him and then looked at Gu Zhe. She swallowed her saliva. That's it? Could the speed of reconciliation be faster than the speed of light? They were already quarreling like this. How could it be over after a nap and a meal? Gu Zhe smiled. Relationships are different from your experiments. He stretched out his finger and shook it gently. It's full of unknowns and variability. Gu Mei followed beside him. Cher gave in just like that? Gu Zhe paused and looked at his sister. He pondered for a while. It should be that both of them took a step back. They alighted from the plane. Gu Mei brought Cher back to the hotel, while Yi Muyun and Gu Zhe went straight to the company. By the time he finished his work and returned, it was already 8 hours later. His little sweetheart was lying on the big bed in his hotel room, sleeping soundly like a child. In fact, she was still a child, so small and soft. Yi Muyun looked at her, and the exhaustion in his body seemed to be soothed. He reached out to take off his tie, unbuttoned his shirt, and took off everything he had. His handsome face was a little depressed. Instead of kissing her, he went to the bathroom to rinse off. After all, he was a 20-year-old young man. When he was at his peak, he only needed to take a shower to recover most of his energy. When he came out, he was already refreshed. He poured himself a glass of red wine and drank it. He stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window at the highest point of the GM Hotel, overlooking the entire land. Slowly drinking the wine in the glass, he moved to the side of the bed, lifted the blanket, and laid down beside the little girl. Her body was fragrant and soft, exuding the unique fragrance of a young girl, causing people to become restless. Moreover, he was in the prime of his youth. Even though he hadn't slept for nearly 40 hours, he was still restless. He closed his eyes and looked at the little girl. Finally, he swept the little girl into his arms and closed his eyes to sleep. After a while, he fell asleep while smelling the faint milky fragrance on her body. There was a slight smile on his lips. 18 years old and still had the milky smell. There was no one else except for the milk yolk bun. Chapter 1997. Yi Muyun was a very disciplined person. She only slept for 6 hours and woke up the next morning when the sky was just starting to brighten. He didn't get up immediately. He just looked at the little pig sleeping soundly in his arms. She was afraid of the cold, so she curled up in his arms and curled into a small ball. Yi Muyun leaned against the headboard and didn't do anything. He just looked at her beautiful face. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but he wanted her to sleep a little longer. He always felt that children needed to sleep more when they were growing up. He just looked at her like that. It wasn't until 7:30 a.m. that Cher woke up. When she opened her eyes, she saw the man's muscular body in his bathrobe. Cher was a little dazed. She buried herself in his arms again and took a deep breath before asking softly, "Aren't you going to get up?" Although she was afraid of him, she was usually a little confused and clingy when she woke up. She liked to hug him and even liked it when he switched places with her. Just like now. Her limbs were wrapped around him and her face was placed on his chest. She seemed to have forgotten how domineering he was and just wanted to sleep on his body for a while longer. Yi Muyun reached out and gently stroked her long hair. She was so comfortable that she squinted her eyes and hummed softly like a kitten. Then, her whole body lay in his arms. Suddenly, her body froze. It was impossible for a 20-year-old man to not have any reaction when he had a girl he liked lying in his arms in the early morning. At this moment, she could clearly feel the changes in his body. She was a little flustered and tried to push herself up, but the more she did, the more she pressed herself against him, and the tighter she clung to him. "Brother!" Her voice was helpless. She was crying and begging him. His eyes darkened. He looked at her silently for a long time. Suddenly, he pressed the back of her head and kissed her lips forcefully. The kiss was lingering and forceful. It went beyond his usual limits. At this moment, he wasn't kissing a girl. He was kissing a woman he had loved for many years. All the passion in his heart was unleashed in this kiss. His hot breath made her tremble in fear. His body temperature was so hot that she almost jumped up. However, she didn't. She could only soften her body and accept the kiss. The way he treated her seemed to be different, as if he had no scruples. Her pajamas were spread open. She wanted to cover herself, but he did not allow it. He admired her inch by inch under the morning sun, worshipping her. In the end, she cried until her eyelids were pink. He seemed to have woken up from a dream and leaned against her neck to calm himself down. After a while, his voice was very soft. Afraid? Just now, he had almost taken her, really possessed her. She, on the other hand, was not that mature yet. He leaned against her neck for a while to calm down, but his blood was still boiling. He hesitated for a moment before he propped himself up. "I'm going to the bathroom." His voice was especially hoarse, but she blushed and turned her face away, not daring to look at him. Her cheeks were rosy, which made him pinch her cheeks. Then, he lifted the blanket and went straight to the bathroom. She thought he was going to wash his face and brush his teeth. After all, it was time for him to get up. However, she had something to say to him. After some thought, she walked to the bathroom door and opened it. "I have something to do." She couldn't finish her sentence, because what he was doing completely stunned her. Chapter 1998. Yi Muyun leaned against the wall lazily. He was initially enjoying himself with his eyes closed. When she came in, he was confused for a moment, but he quickly pulled her over and held her tightly in his arms. "Let go of me." Cher did not dare to look at him in his arms. She did not dare to look at his body, his expression, and his gaze. Everything was shameful. Yi Muyun looked at her tightly shut eyes and laughed in a low voice. "Baby, open your eyes and take a look." "I don't want to." Her voice was trembling as she closed her eyes even more tightly. He laughed even more wantonly as he teased her. "Baby, just take a look." His thin lips moved closer to her ear, and his voice was hoarse. "Baby, do you know what Big Brother is doing?" As he said that, he even grabbed her little hand and let her experience it herself. Cher let out a shrill scream. This was the first time he had ever treated her like this. He had never done it before. She was terrified and panicked. She retracted her little hand and refused to, but this time, he refused to let her go. He bit her little ear and coaxed her. "Help Big Brother." "Huh? No. I don't want to." She was no different from a kitten. She shook her head and even cried. But his bad habits were completely provoked. Coupled with her disobedience, he grabbed her little hand without a care and forced her to do shameful things. Even when she cried and begged, he did not let her go. He only hugged her when he was satisfied. After he calmed down, he began to coax her. But the little girl was angry and would not forgive him so easily. She lay on his shoulder and bit him hard. Yi Muyun chuckled. He knew that the little girl was angry. He pulled a tissue from the side and wiped her little hand. Then, he pulled her into the shower. Another first. She refused and cried miserably. Because she did not want to stand with him naked. She would be seen naked. Even if they would do shameful things in the future, that would be in the future. She really could not accept it now. She kept throwing a tantrum and crying miserably. In the end, he had no choice but to fill the bathtub with water and soak her in. She shyly took off her pajamas and put in a lot of bubbles until she could no longer be seen. As for him, he took a shower. She didn't dare to look at him, and her face was lowered. She only glanced at him once and didn't dare to look at him again. She only knew that his body was very strong and also very scary. Yes, it was too scary. Cher bit her lip. Her eyes seemed to be filled with tears as she sneaked a peek at him again. He was clearly very lean, but why was it that in some aspects, she felt a little scared just by looking at him? According to the book, it had to be this and that, and this and that. She felt that if it was really like that, she would die of pain. Even now, her little palm was still burning hot, as if a layer of skin had been rubbed off. Yi Muyun was ready very quickly and walked over without any hesitation. In his heart, he already had a plan. On her birthday, he proposed and took her. He wouldn't wait any longer because he couldn't bear the fact that she wasn't his. Now, he hoped that she could adapt to him and not be afraid when the time came. He squatted at the edge of the bathtub and stared at her little face. You have to get used to it in the future. He wouldn't let it go just because he had taken her once. They would do it often in the future. He didn't want to scare her. Chapter 1999. Although the excessive work consumed a portion of his energy, he still had to go to the gym a few times a week to use up his excess energy. Yi Muyun's slender fingers stroked her red lips gently. He thought to himself, once a man has started, he probably can't restrain himself anymore. Moreover, he didn't want to restrain himself anymore. He wanted her so much that his body ached. She didn't know how many imaginations he had in his mind, even though only her shoulders were exposed in the bathtub. Yi Muyun traced her lips gently. As she trembled, he said in a hoarse voice, "Shall I carry you up?" She hugged her own body in an instant. Lowering her face, she said softly, "Go out first." However, he didn't move. He remained dangerously by the bathtub and moved his finger downwards from her mouth. She trembled even more violently. She looked up at him and called out, "Brother," again. He reached out and carried her forcefully, walking straight to the bedroom. He dressed her as if he was taking care of a baby in a perverted manner. His actions were very slow and unhurried. Moreover, his gaze was fixed on her throughout the entire process. She couldn't take it anymore. She closed her eyes and didn't dare to look at him. He whispered in her ear, "Afraid of me, huh?" Cher trembled even more. She buried her face in the pillow and didn't make a sound. He helped her change into a thin woolen dress. Patting her, he turned around to change his clothes. He didn't avoid her. He took out some clothes from the changing room and put them by the bed. He removed the towel and changed. Cher curled up at the head of the bed and hugged her knees. She bit her lip. Actually, she could feel the change between them. It seemed like he didn't want to wait for her to grow up. She had this realization, which meant that she had actually grown up. "You're not afraid anymore?" Yi Muyun's tone was indifferent as he looked at her. Cher bit her lip and turned her face away. Her little face was filled with the eyes of an 18-year-old. She didn't make a sound. He only smiled and didn't force her. After all, there was still a month before her birthday. He had already started preparing for her birthday. By then, he would truly have her. Yi Muyun had an important meeting in the morning, so he had to go to the company after breakfast with her. Breakfast was relatively pleasant. Even when she asked him when she would be returning to B-City, he did not get angry. He only said that his work would end in 5 days. Cher heaved a sigh of relief. She planned to fight for it slowly after she returned to B-City. Even if it was the same as before, he and the chauffeur could pick her up. She could skip any activities and go home obediently. She could not stand Gu Mei following her to school. It was not that she hated Gu Mei, but it was tantamount to surveillance. She was smart enough not to bring it up immediately. Instead, she obediently lifted her eyes and allowed him to kiss her on the lips. "If I wasn't afraid that you'd be bored, I would take you to the office." His lips pressed against hers as he whispered. Then he stared at her. Xiaoxin felt a lot of pressure and coughed lightly. "Actually, I prefer to watch movies in the hotel." He didn't force her to go to the office with him because she could only sleep there. He would rather make her happy. However, he asked Gu Mei to stay with her. He and Gu Zhe wouldn't leave. After they left, Gu Mei lay on the sofa on the other side and waved at her. "Cher, why do you like such a boring man?" He's always working and working. Chapter 2000. Gu Mei thought that Yi Muyun was only 20 years old. Wasn't it a little too much for him to be the vice president of a multinational company? What fun was there in working all day at such a young age? However, thinking about it, the only fun Yi Muyun had was probably Cher. Look at Cher. If Gu Mei were a man, she wouldn't want to go out either. She would rather be with her all day. Gu Mei asked. Cher lay on her stomach and thought about it before saying softly, I don't know. It seems like it was a long time ago. She stuck out her tongue. I used to hate him. She was more afraid because her brother always looked like he wanted to eat her up. She was so young back then. How could she not be afraid? Gu Mei kept smiling. That's right. It was very difficult for a woman to like a man like Yi Muyun. It wasn't because he wasn't outstanding, but because he was too outstanding. There would be a sense of oppression. Women who liked him would examine themselves all day long, wondering if they had done something wrong, if they weren't worthy of him. They were afraid that even if they liked him, they would have already driven themselves crazy before they could achieve their goal. However, Cher didn't have such pressure. Between her and the big boss, the one who would drive herself crazy might be the big boss. Yi Muyun loved her to the point of being a little paranoid, and he was just stuck in it without knowing it. However, Cher was silent. She lay on her stomach for a long time without making a sound. At the same time, Yi Muyun was in the middle of a meeting in the New York conference room of Boyi Group. Suddenly his phone rang. The phone belonged to Cher, and the number was unknown. He remembered that there was no one else in her phone other than her family and him. Pursing his thin lips, he gestured for Gu Zhe to continue hosting the meeting. He took her phone and walked out of the conference room. The senior executives who stayed behind looked at each other. Mr. Yi had never acted like this before. Gu Zhe knew what was going on. He didn't say anything and continued hosting the meeting. When Yi Muyun opened the door, he answered the phone at the same time. His tone was rather calm. I'm Yi Muyun. With that, he opened the door, leaned against the wall of the corridor outside the door, took out a cigarette, put it to his lips, and lit it. The person on the other side paused for a moment. Although he didn't speak immediately, he could tell from his breathing that it was a man. As for who it was, there was no need to ask any more. Yi Muyun's long eyelashes drooped. His watery eyes suddenly seemed to have limitless sharpness, especially the faint red mole at the corner of his eye, which made his sharp aura seem a little gentler. Both sides were silent for a moment, and then he said, Zhou Chongguang? I'm looking for Tang Cher. Zhou Chongguang didn't show any stage fright in the face of such an imposing manner and directly stated his purpose. Yi Muyun smiled faintly, raised his neck slightly, and took a long and shallow puff of the cigarette. He was young after all, and his skin was as fair as jade. This posture was actually very attractive, but fortunately, no subordinate saw it. She's in New York, so there's no need for her to answer your call. Also, she won't participate in any activities in the future. Yi Muyun was quite straightforward. In the future, Zhou Chongguang would have no reason to look for Cher. Zhou Chongguang was stunned for a moment, and then he couldn't calm down. He was a little angry. You call this house arrest? Do you think you really love her? There's no need to explain to outsiders. There was a hint of displeasure in Yi Muyun's voice. Stay away from her, or else I can't guarantee that Glory Enterprise will be safe and sound. Chapter 2001. Zhou Chongguang was young after all. He didn't know anything about Yi Muyun's ruthlessness. He was slightly annoyed. You don't have the right to treat her like this. She deserves the respect she deserves. However, Yi Muyun had already hung up. Zhou Chongguang looked at his phone in a daze. He could feel that Yi Muyun had a perverted possessiveness towards Tang Cher. However, was this something a girl should bear? He didn't think so. Zhao Zi patted his shoulder and shook his head. Forget it. There are plenty of fish in the sea. Zhou Chongguang looked at Zhao Zi with a stunned expression. She's in New York. She was taken away because of a meal. Yi Muyun's feelings were so strong that it was scary. Chongguang, you can't get involved. They have a 10-year relationship. Zhao Zi stopped joking. Even if Tang Cher cries and begs to be with you, Yi Muyun won't let go. The two of them would definitely be together. Only Chongguang would be hurt, and he could see it clearly. He didn't want Chongguang to be hurt because of this. He had a bright future. Zhou Chongguang pursed his lips and sighed. This is the first time I've liked a girl so much. No, not just like. He murmured. I can't bear to. Zhao Zi patted him and said, it's a consensual thing. Besides, he paused for a moment before saying, even if you want to be with her, you have to wait for them. If they break up, you'll be a homewrecker. It was hard to imagine a proud person like Zhou Chongguang being associated with a homewrecker. Zhao Zi looked at Zhou Chongguang after saying that. Zhou Chongguang said in a low voice, I want to go to New York. Zhao Zi's mouth opened wide in disbelief. It took him a long time to find his voice. Chongguang, are you possessed? You've only known her for a few days. Zhou Chongguang's voice was faint. I know what you're thinking, but for me, if I don't go, I won't be satisfied. In New York, Yi Muyun looked at the phone in his hand. After a while, he deleted the call history. Take Zhou Chongguang for example. Between him and Cher, he wasn't that important, but he was annoying. Stepping into the conference room again, the subordinates could clearly feel that Mr. Ye's style of hosting the meeting was much sharper. Gu Zhe glanced at him nonchalantly, guessing in his heart, it was probably because of the little girl. After the meeting, Gu Zhe followed Yi Muyun back to the office. Yi Muyun's tone was indifferent. Bring me the documents of Glory Enterprise in B City. Gu Zhe's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help but say, Mr. Yi? Of course, he knew why Yi Muyun was using Glory Enterprise. He was probably using his position to get back at him. What is it? Yi Muyun held a cigarette in one hand, turned on his laptop, and looked at Gu Zhe indifferently. Gu Zhe shrugged and immediately went to get the documents. In less than 10 minutes, he brought them over with both hands. He had thought that Mr. Yi would discuss it with him, but Yi Muyun only said indifferently, put it on the table. Gu Zhe was puzzled. Was Mr. Yi going to do it himself? But he didn't ask and quickly left. After he left, Yi Muyun stretched out her hand and picked up the document. She swept her gaze over it and looked at it quietly. After a long time, a faint sneer appeared on her lips. Chapter 2002. But in the end, he still threw the documents into the drawer and ignored it. When he returned to the hotel, he did not see Cher. He called Gu Mei and Gu Mei told him that she had brought Cher out for some ice. Wasn't the weather cold? He tore off his tie slowly and asked for the address before driving over. In the dessert shop, Cher had a huge banana split in front of her. She was digging and eating like a child. Gu Mei was amazed. She pinched the flesh on the young girl's arm and drooled. You're such a horrible eater and yet you're so skinny. God is unfair. Not only was she skinny, but she was also very attractive in certain areas. She was really blessed by the heavens. Gu Mei could imagine how a beast like Yi Muyun would be beastly when he looked at such a sweetheart. Cher looked up and said slowly, I was very fat when I was young. She remembered that when she was young, Yi Muyun used to call her a little yellow bun, saying that she was fat. Oh, Gu Mei replied. Her gaze landed on Cher's neck again. It was so tender that she wanted to take a bite. Cher finally had a meal and naturally couldn't bear to let it go. She ate until her mouth was all over the place. At this moment, someone rubbed the back of her head. She looked back instinctively and saw Yi Muyun. It was only noon. Why wasn't he at the office? Cher looked at him curiously as she dug into the dessert. There are 2 hours of rest in the afternoon, Yi Muyun said casually. Gu Mei secretly made a face. Of course not. Boss was also very busy in the afternoon before, okay? But Cher believed that he was very free. Yi Muyun sat down and called the waiter over. He was prepared to have some food on the spot. It seemed like she wasn't going to move. He was still very tolerant of such little hobbies, especially when she ate. It was very cute. He looked at the menu and frowned. Fortunately, there were simple meals here. He ordered 2 simple dishes and asked Gu Mei. Gu Mei shrugged her shoulders. Me too. Just as Yi Muyun was about to speak to the waiter, Cher scooted over and rested her little face on his shoulder. She said pitifully, Big brother, I want to eat some butter. Yi Muyun looked at the dessert in front of her and frowned. Can you eat it? Cher didn't say anything. She just stared at him. She couldn't even have dessert when he brought her to New York. Angry. Yi Muyun tilted his head and looked at the little face on his shoulder. He snorted softly. Have you forgotten about the stomach ache last time? It was a cold. It had nothing to do with dessert. Cher blinked her big eyes and stared at him. In the end, the elder brother gave in. Yi Muyun closed the menu in his hand and reached out to pinch her soft little face. He smiled faintly. His slender fingers reached out to wipe the corner of her mouth, and the little girl immediately wagged her tail happily after getting the new dessert. Gume was stunned. She had seen many lovers, but this was the first time she had seen one like this. And Cher lowered her head and finished her dessert at an incredible speed. Then she waited anxiously for the new dessert. At this moment, Yi Muyun and Gume's simple meal arrived. He didn't eat it immediately but forced Cher to eat some. Cher's eyes were filled with tears. She touched her little belly. She was full. Brother is bad. Yi Muyun fed her enough before he ate himself. Her dessert was also served. Chapter 2003. Gume looked at her lying on Yi Muyun's shoulder like a little bear and was a little worried. Mr. Yi, is Cher okay? Cher raised her little paw. Gume, I need to digest. Her voice was weak. Yi Muyun frowned. Are you feeling unwell? Actually, she was feeling unwell, but she didn't dare to say it. She shook her head. Oh. He looked at her. His gaze was a little deep and there was a faint spark. Gume said knowingly, then I'll go take a walk first. Mr. Yi, you can send Cher back to the hotel later. Yi Muyun nodded lightly. Gume made a face at Cher and left first. Once she left, Cher wanted to say something, but her little face was turned to face him. He sighed. Little fool. With that said, he kissed her. It wasn't a deep kiss, but it was a lingering one. After all, she was a little shy outside. Her body was curled up in his arms, and she was forced to raise her little face to be kissed by him. He kissed her for a while before letting go of her. Her eyes were already filled with infatuation. Good girl, he said hoarsely. His slender and beautiful fingers caressed her lips. It was a little seductive. Cher's face was a little hot. She felt that there was a deeper meaning behind his caressing her lips, so she buried her face in his arms and refused to come out. Yi Muyun laughed softly. He lowered his head and buried it in her neck. He asked in a low voice, not angry anymore? Her little hands were hugging his waist. In fact, she was already in his arms, looking very intimate. Still angry. She pursed her lips and lowered her head. What's the use of being angry? She was still locked up in New York and couldn't go back. How could Yi Muyun not know what the little girl was thinking? He chuckled. Didn't she come over to accompany you in the afternoon? She looked up. She was afraid of him, but she couldn't help but say, there was dessert to accompany me and Gume. Yi Muyun's voice was slightly hoarse. Gume, can I kiss you like this? She blushed and lowered her head. Her little hand hooked onto his. Although she did not speak, he knew that she did not want to talk about this outside. She would be shy. He didn't force her. He reached out and stroked her hair. I'll take you back to the hotel. Actually, she wanted to go shopping with Gume today, but he came and Gume left. She could only go back to the hotel with him. When they arrived at the hotel, he still had an hour. Yi Muyun coaxed her to sleep. But Cher was being hugged by a mature man. How could she fall asleep? Moreover, she realized that he had no intention of booking another room for her. She wanted to say it but did not dare to, so they had to sleep in the same bed for the entire week. Yi Muyun's little body moved around. He opened his eyes and asked, "Why aren't you sleeping?" She leaned on him, her face pressed against his waist, and whispered, "You're hugging me a little too tightly." He chuckled. "If you can't sleep, then don't sleep." She was still in a daze. He had already hugged her and kissed her. He had wanted to do this when they were outside. Recently, he had been kissing her without restraint. He didn't care if he would ignite the fire in his body as he kissed her deeply. She was forced to cry by him. She cried softly and cried no, because he was holding her hand again, forcing her to do those things to him. She was crying so hard that he couldn't bear to do it anymore. He coaxed her softly, and as he coaxed her, she fell asleep. Yi Muyun looked at her sleeping face. He couldn't help but hold her little hand. Chapter 2004. He could naturally feel that it was getting harder and harder for him to control his emotions. Perhaps it was because her birthday was getting closer and closer, or perhaps it was because she was getting better and better. After he had completely calmed down, he lifted his body slightly, kissed her, and walked into the bathroom to take a shower. He had a meeting to attend in the afternoon, so he had to return to the office. He whispered into her ear, "Baby, I'm leaving first. I'll be back at 6 for dinner, okay?" She was sleeping soundly. She waved her hand and slapped him on the face with a loud smack. Yi Muyun was stunned for a moment, then he smiled and didn't think much of it. He liked it when she was like this. He liked it when they got along without any barriers. He didn't like it when she was afraid of him. At this moment, his heart was burning. He lowered his body and kissed her little face. Even though she couldn't hear him, he felt an indescribable warmth in his heart as he spoke. When he left, his heart was still boiling. However, before the meeting ended, Gume called and said that Cher had acute gastroenteritis and was now in the hospital. Yi Muyun was not in the mood to continue with his work. He did not rush to a private hospital, so Gu Zhe took his place to host the meeting. When he arrived at the hospital, his condition was better than he had expected. It was just a little inflammation. He should be fine after 2 days of 4 drips. When he saw her, the nurse was about to give her an 4 drip. The little girl had tears in her eyes and was biting her lips pitifully. Yi Muyun walked over and leaned against the headboard. Cher sobbed and leaned on his shoulder. She said in a weak voice, "Brother, I don't want an injection." He knew that she had always been afraid of pain, just like Pei Chichi. He reached out and pressed her shoulder, coaxing her. "It won't hurt if you poke it." "It hurts." She wasn't a fool. She knew that he loved her, so she kept on acting, and he could only keep on coaxing her. Gu Mei had heard from her brother how much Mr. Yi doted on his little girlfriend. She thought it was just like any other person. But now, she had a feeling that although the two of them were only 2 years apart, it was obvious that Mr. Yi doted on Cher like a daughter. That was why he was so overbearing. Gu Mei did not understand how complicated this feeling was. At this time, Yi Muyun comforted the young girl and gave the nurse a look. The nurse quickly inserted the needle. Gu Mei heard a pig-like squeal. "What beautiful girl! What little fairy!" They were all gone. There was only howling like a pig being slaughtered. Gu Mei was stunned at first, then she smiled sinisterly. She looked at Yi Muyun and cleared her throat. "Mr. Yi, Cher seems to be afraid of pain. She cried like this after being pricked by a needle. Tears and mucus were flying everywhere. If it was her first time with Mr. Yi, this was much thicker than a needle, and also much more violent. Wouldn't he cry to death?" Whenever Gu Mei thought of Yi Muyun being stuck in the middle, unable to move up or down, she laughed in her heart. Yi Muyun glared at her for harboring ill intentions, but her expression was a little disheveled. Yes, he was so petty and afraid of pain. Usually, he cried like this when he bit her neck. If that was really the case, how would he cry? Just thinking about it now made him feel endless distress. And the little girl in his arms howled for a long time after being pricked by the needle. Finally, she lost all her strength and fell asleep in his arms, tired and sleepy. Chapter 2005. It was Yi Muyun's endless love that gave Cher a sense of security. That was why she could sleep peacefully in his arms. Gu Mei looked on with envy. This was a childhood sweetheart. There shouldn't be anything else between them. Cher wanted freedom, but Yi Muyun probably wanted that sense of security. No matter how strong and valiant he appeared, deep in his heart, he was still afraid of losing her. He didn't believe that if he let go, his little girl would still be his. He watched over her quietly until the sky turned dark. Gu Mei said softly, "Mr. Yi, I'll go back to the hotel and get someone to prepare some food. The doctor said that Cher should eat something light." Cher had been spoiled since she was young. She didn't trust the food outside, and GM had the best Chinese chef. When she said that, Yi Muyun nodded lightly and passed the car key to Gu Mei. When only he and Cher were left in the ward, he turned sideways and hugged the little girl with one hand. His forehead was pressed against hers, and he murmured, "I shouldn't have let you eat 2 portions." Sometimes he indulged her too much. Even though he knew that she might have an gastrointestinal infection, he couldn't bear to eat her when she wanted to eat. Gu Mei returned to GM Hotel and instructed the 5-star chef to make a bowl of hot porridge. While waiting, she wanted to go back to her room to take a shower. The elevator opened. She saw a very refined and handsome young man at the door. Gu Mei hesitated and asked, "Looking for me?" Zhou Chongguang looked at Gu Mei and smiled politely. "My name is Zhou Chongguang." As soon as he finished speaking, Gu Mei looked at him with a complicated gaze. She had thought that this guy was quite good-looking, but she hadn't expected him to be boss's mistress. He was fine and looked decent. Why did he have to become a male mistress? In terms of looks, there wasn't much difference between the male mistress and boss. However, it wasn't appearance that mattered now. It was aura. Think about it, boss was only 20 years old, but he was already the vice president of Boyi and had control of hundreds of billions of assets. With a stomp of his foot, the entire B city would shake, not to mention that he was the designated successor of President Tang. The male mistress in front of her, on the other hand, was as gentle as jade and looked harmless. There was no way he could fight against the boss. She had seen the boss's ruthlessness before. It was the ruthlessness of a man in his 30s. Thinking of this, Gu Mei almost pitied the male mistress. He could have gone against anyone, but he had to go against the big boss. Zhou Chongguang? Is it the Zhou Chongguang who is pursuing Cher? Gu Mei's voice was light. But you're late. Cher isn't here. She's in the hospital. Zhou Chongguang frowned. Why did he go to the hospital? Gu Mei leaned against the wall and laughed. Do you believe that I was tortured by Mr. Yi? Zhou Chongguang's expression did not look too good. He could tell that Gu Mei's words were mocking him. Gu Mei stopped joking and reminded him kindly, I don't need to say it. You should be able to guess why Cher was brought to New York. So, Zhou Chongguang, don't get close to her anymore. She doesn't need you to save her. If you get close to her, it will only make her life difficult. Zhou Chongguang clenched his fists slowly and his face was a little depressed. If they are good, why is she in the hospital? Chapter 2006. Zhou Chongguang's lips moved slightly. Before he could say anything, Gu Mei continued, just like what you're thinking, Cher was unhappy at first and would resist. But their relationship for so many years couldn't be broken just like that. She looked at him and said softly, they've already reconciled. Gu Mei said so much because she wanted Zhou Chongguang to know that there was no room for a third person in their world. Zhou Chongguang had a hard time digesting Gu Mei's words. After a long time, he said softly, I just want to see her. Gu Mei sighed in her heart. What an infatuated person. Then she smiled. All right, but I can't guarantee that it will be a good scene. She said it very straightforwardly, but Zhou Chongguang knew that she was sick after running around the world. He wouldn't be at ease if he didn't see her. So, when Gu Mei arrived at the hospital, she brought Zhou Chongguang with her. She didn't tell Yi Muyun beforehand. When she reached the ward, she looked at Zhou Chongguang. Wait for me outside. Zhou Chongguang didn't want to make things difficult for her, so he nodded. Gu Mei walked into the ward. Yi Muyun was sitting on the sofa handling work while Cher seemed to be asleep. She walked over and said softly, Mr. Yi, there's a classmate who wants to see Cher. The pen in Yi Muyun's hand paused for a moment. Instantly he roughly knew who it was. His tone was a little indifferent. Tell him that I won't be seeing him. Gu Mei coughed softly. Mr. Yi, can you represent Cher? What if she wakes up and makes a fuss again? Yi Muyun looked up at Gu Mei and said in a bad tone, You seem to have forgotten who pays your salary. Gu Mei immediately touched her nose and went out. She looked at Zhou Chongguang and smiled mischievously. Classmate Zhou, I'm sorry. Mr. Yi won't let me see him. Zhou Chongguang looked down and said in a low voice, What about Cher? I suggest you call her Tang Cher. After all, we're not that close, and it's unlikely that we'll be that close in the future. Gu Mei reminded him in a tone that was neither too light nor too heavy. I've said it before, if you get close to her, it will only make her life harder. Zhou Chongguang looked up at Gu Mei and asked softly, you all think it's good for her to be with him like this, right? You think she's very happy, right? Gu Mei smiled. You have to ask Cher herself whether she is happy or not. After that, she said softly, Zhou Chongguang, Cher likes Mr. Yi. She won't like anyone else. Now that Yi Muyun had fallen in love with her, she couldn't run away. She was willing and didn't want to run. Zhou Chongguang slowly took a step back and leaned against the wall. He did not say anything. After a long time, Gu Mei looked at him walking toward the elevator. She looked at his thin back view and suddenly felt a little pity for him. It must be the first time that such an outstanding boy fell in love with someone. It was a pity that he had met such a strong opponent like Mr. Yi. She felt sorry for Zhou Chongguang. Gu Mei watched him disappear in the elevator before returning to the ward. Hearing the door open, Yi Muyun didn't even raise his head. He only said calmly, is he gone? Gu Mei closed the door and nodded. She then looked at the girl lying on the hospital bed. At this moment, her Mr. Ye's voice rang out again. I don't want her to know that Zhou Chongguang has been to New York. Gu Mei, you know what to do. Gu Mei cursed in her heart. How could a pure lamb like Zhou Chongguang fight against such a black-bellied big boss? Chapter 2007. Gu Mei came back to her senses. What about Cher? Someone had to take care of her, especially changing her clothes and wiping her body. Gu Mei felt that she had the attributes of an old maid. But her Mr. Yi paused and said naturally, I will take care of her. Gu Mei felt that it was inappropriate at first, but then she thought about it. Cher and Mr. Yi seemed to have slept together a long time ago. Changing clothes was probably a piece of cake. Thinking of this, she looked at Yi Muyun as if she was looking at a beast. Yi Muyun glanced at her. Gu Mei pointed at the food box. Other than Cher's porridge, I also brought Mr. Ye's dinner and 2 bags of clothes. The more she said, the more she felt that she had the potential to be an old maid. But Mr. Yi seemed to want to be an old maid more. Gu Mei left. On the first floor of the hospital, she saw Zhou Chongguang. The young man, who looked very young and outstanding, was leaning against the wall and smoking. She noticed that the brand of the cigarette was American, and Zhou Chongguang coughed violently for a long time after taking a puff. Gu Mei couldn't bear to look at him. You don't know how to smoke, but you still want to pretend to be profound. Gu Mei leaned against him and looked at Zhou Chongguang with her head tilted. Do you have any more cigarettes? Zhou Chongguang looked at her. Before he said anything, Gu Mei had already taken out a cigarette from his pocket. She lit it up skillfully and puffed at his handsome face. Zhou Chongguang looked at her and pursed his lips. It's not good for girls to smoke. Who made that rule? Gu Mei's beautiful fingers held the cigarette and her eyes were a little blurred. When I was smoking, you were still peeing your pants. She patted his shoulder comfortingly. Gu Mei was actually the same age as Zhou Chongguang, but she was sent abroad when she was young. Those papers drove her crazy. She started smoking when she was 12 or 13, but she didn't smoke so much in the past 2 years. Zhou Chongguang looked at Gu Mei. Gu Mei blew out a beautiful smoke ring. A good student should go back and study hard. This place doesn't suit you, and Cher doesn't suit you either. She took the cigarette from his fingers and narrowed her eyes. Let's leave New York. Zhou Chongguang didn't say anything and walked out of the corridor. This child is really stubborn. Gu Mei put the cigarette to her lips and took a deep puff. She narrowed her eyes and looked at Zhou Chongguang's back. In the ward, Yi Muyun walked over and sat at the head of the bed, looking at Cher. Her little face was still a little pale as she lay there quietly. His large palm caressed her slightly cold face and patted it lightly. Baby. Cher slowly woke up. She opened her eyes to look at him and softly called out, Brother? Get up and eat some porridge. He gently ruffled her fluffy hair and helped her up. Cher looked out of the window and asked quietly, Brother, what time is it? Yi Muyun smiled and kissed her little ear. It's almost 8 o'clock. Are you hungry? Cher looked around and saw the 2 lunchboxes. She knew that he hadn't eaten yet, so she pulled his sleeve and said softly, Brother, have you eaten? Yi Muyun felt an indescribable warmth in his heart. He stroked her long hair. I'll feed you first, and you can feed me later, okay? She stared at him and gasped. I'm a patient. Chapter 2008. She obediently lay in his arms and said, Baby, hurry up and eat. Big brother will be able to eat soon. After she said that, his gaze fell on her face. After a while, he rubbed her hair and said, Idiot? I'm not an idiot, she said childishly. Then she leaned in his arms and ate obediently. Every time she was so obedient, he would have the illusion that he was a father. Just thinking about it made his heart warm up again. As he rubbed and fed her, he couldn't help but scold her, You're not allowed to eat random things in the future. Cher obediently listened and said in a small voice, Then I'll only eat one in the future. As she said that, she looked at him eagerly. There was a touch of moving moisture in her eyes. Yi Muyun reached out and covered her eyes. Because she was looking at him, he couldn't do anything to her. The little girl lifted her little body and hugged his arm with some difficulty. Her voice was extremely soft. Big brother. There was a teasing cry in her pleading voice. She didn't even know how seductive she was. Yi Muyun let go of his hand and looked at her cute little face. He knocked her little head and said, You're still in the hospital and you're already thinking about eating. He suddenly lifted her chin and asked her seriously, Baby, do you like to eat salty things? For some reason, Cher felt that his gaze was a bit domineering, as if it was dyed with a layer of jade. She didn't understand what he was saying, but she was a little scared at the moment. So, her voice trembled a little. Oh. She liked sweet things since she was a child and didn't like salty things. She originally thought that he wouldn't force her, but his fingers touched her red lips and his voice was very calm. You have to like it in the future. The little girl asked boldly. In fact, she was actually afraid. Yi Muyun's fingers were still slowly touching her red lips. He said indifferently, Because I want you to eat it. The little girl lowered her little face. After a long time, she softly said, I'll eat it. Big brother was bad. Big brother forced her to eat things she didn't like. But when she grew up, she would think that he was even worse. The young man looked at the little girl crying. Even the way she cried was extremely moving, and he couldn't help but laugh. He reached out and rubbed her hair. Little fool. After Cher finished eating, she tugged at his clothes. Brother. When her brother lowered his gaze and stared at her for a long time, she didn't know that her brother only wanted to eat her up. In the end, Yi Muyun hastily ate some. After cleaning up, he took a hot towel and helped her wipe her body. When he helped her wipe, both of them felt uncomfortable. After all, they were both young men and women, and he was hot-blooded. Looking at the tender little girl, his whole body was hot, and his hands rubbed harder and harder. Cher called him Big Brother, her voice extremely seductive. Yi Muyun looked at her and abruptly threw away the towel in his hand. His large palm replaced the towel. The quilt rose and fell, and from time to time, the soft voice of a little girl could be heard, Big brother, be good, don't move. He coaxed her, but she really didn't listen. In the end, he could only hold her little hand and pin it to the side of his body. He was too distressed. How should he treat her? He only kissed her once and she was already this scared. Chapter 2009. She couldn't move and couldn't see, but she could feel the hidden warmth coming from his body. She suddenly burst into tears, biting her lips as she cried, making his heart flutter. If you cry again, I will eat you under the blanket. She cried like this, but he felt that it was very sweet, so he wanted to scare her. He was this childish, but he would only be like this in front of her. His gaze was completely scattered, only the little girl's cries were real. His heart was extremely soft, he hugged her and coaxed her for a long time. Until he couldn't breathe, he pulled off the blanket, and the light in front of him suddenly brightened. The little girl was obediently lying in his arms, looking indescribably obedient. Yi Muyun lowered his head, kissed her eyes, and smiled. You're still crying, you're already so big. As he said that, his hands started to mess around, and he rubbed her a few times. Cher raised her head, her little nose was red, and there were 2 tears on her long eyelashes. She realized that he bullied her, but it was also very comfortable, so she softly hummed, like a cat. Originally, he just wanted to tease her, but now he couldn't let go. He whispered in her ear, "Baby, help me, okay?" Cher's breathing was messed up, and she looked at him with a gaze that made his hair stand. After a while, she softly said, "Brother, I'm sick. Brother is also sick. If you don't believe me, see if you're different from usual." The bully brother shamelessly forced her to do what she did for him that day, and Cher had no choice but to do it while crying. In the end, she still threw a little tantrum and hurt him. Even if he was angry, he couldn't let it out because she was crying so hard. Moreover, he did bully her when she was sick. As she cried, his heart sweetly thought that it was good to be like this for the rest of his life. In their world, there was no one else. As he coaxed her, Cher fell asleep. Yi Muyun hugged her and took out his laptop to deal with his work. It wasn't until late at night that he hugged her to sleep. The next morning, he had to go to the company and asked Gu Mei to accompany him. However, before he left, he still fed her before leaving and helped her change into a new set of pajamas. Gu Mei saw the meticulous service and didn't know if she should sympathize with Cher or feel happy for her. It should be every girl's dream to be doted on by such a handsome and capable man. After Yi Muyun left, Gu Mei poured a glass of warm water for Cher, but before she passed it to her, she found a suspicious hickey on Cher's neck. A few of them had been kissed until they were green and purple. She was a little stunned. Mr. Yi was really a beast. Gu Mei's eyes felt a little hot as she looked at him. "Does it hurt?" His fingers touched it lightly, and Cher covered it with the blanket. Her face was flushed red. Gu Mei smiled. "Does it hurt?" "It's all right." Cher bit her lip. "Have you ever been bitten?" Gu Mei was 2 years older than her. She should have had a boyfriend, right? As she asked this, Gu Mei's expression was a little stunned. Then she smiled lightly. "Oh," Cher replied. Then, she said slowly, "I wanted to ask you how it feels to be in love." Gu Mei imitated her and hugged her knees. After a while, she said, "I think I like someone." Chapter 2010. When she woke up early in the morning, there were different men beside her. She had sex with those men, but there was no feeling at all. She got tired of it. She started to be alone. She couldn't fall in love with anyone. She thought she didn't have the ability to love anyone. Until she saw that white moonlight. Unfortunately, that white moonlight also belonged to someone else. That white moonlight loved innocent girls like crazy. Gu Mei laughed softly. She laughed so hard that she was about to cry. Yes, everyone liked innocence. She liked innocence too. But she knew she wasn't worthy. She had long been dyed black. When Gu Mei came back to her senses, she saw Cher staring at her. She couldn't help but laugh. "But, is it strange that I like someone?" Cher stuck out her tongue. "I thought you only liked those profound numbers." Gu Mei blinked. "I also like those profound postures." Cher's face turned red. She called out softly, "Gu Mei." Gu Mei looked at her blushing face. She thought that Mr. Yi probably didn't go to the last step. Otherwise, Cher wouldn't be so shy. She admired Mr. Yi a little. He actually didn't eat up such a tender girl by lying with him every day. Thinking about it, his self-control was too good. After Gu Mei was done teasing the little girl, she let her get up. After a while, the nurse's doctor came over. After a checkup and confirming that there were no major problems, she would be put on a drip for another 2 days. Cher lay on the bed. She looked out of the window in boredom. Then, she looked at Gu Mei and said softly, "Gu Mei, after I'm done with the drip, how about we go out for a walk?" Gu Mei lay on the sofa and looked at her. "I don't dare. You are Mr. Ye's darling. You are sick now. Just lie down obediently." Cher was a little disappointed. She pouted and didn't say anything. Gu Mei was still looking at her. Looking at her beautiful face, she thought to herself, "Such a beautiful girl. No wonder Mr. Yi treasured her so much." Even she couldn't help but feel that the white moonlight was so beautiful. She looked at her silently for a long time. Only then did she retract her gaze. But she couldn't control her emotions. At noon, the manager of GM Hotel personally delivered the food. When she went down to get it, she saw Zhou Chongguang on the first floor. He sat quietly on the bench on the first floor of the hospital. He didn't sit on anything. He just sat there as if he was waiting for someone. Gu Mei sat beside him. "Who are you waiting for?" Zhou Chongguang looked at her quietly. "Oh." Gu Mei patted his arm. "Do you have a cigarette?" Zhou Chongguang's gaze deepened. "Smoking is prohibited here." "Oh," Gu Mei slowly replied. Then she picked up the lunchbox in her hands. "I'm going up, you." Zhou Chongguang looked at her and said with difficulty, "Can I see her?" Gu Mei sighed. "Why bother? She won't belong to you." After a pause, she said, "Don't make things difficult for me." Zhou Chongguang did not speak again. Gu Mei could not help but ask, "Will you still wait here?" He grunted and smiled. "I won't make things difficult for you." Gu Mei froze and looked down. "I'll let you see her. But don't let her find out." She looked up again. Her gaze was indifferent. "I've said it before. Your liking is her burden." She had seen Cher and Yi Muyun interact. If there was no one else, Cher would be able to live her life happily. Who said that girls had to have their own opinions? Chapter 2011. Gu Mei had agreed to it because she wanted Zhou Chongguang to give up on her. After she said that, Zhou Chongguang's eyes lit up a little. Gu Mei's heart screamed. "Sigh, don't try to seduce me," even though he did it unconsciously. There was a thirst in Zhou Chongguang's eyes. His voice was very soft. "I won't make things difficult for you. I just want to take a look." After taking a look, he would go back to be city and give up on her. Gu Mei stood up. "Let's go." Zhou Chongguang first walked beside her, then followed behind her. Gu Mei smiled and didn't say anything. When they reached the VIP ward on the top floor, Gu Mei stood at the door. "I'll go in later. I won't close the door yet. You can leave after taking a look." This was all she could do. She knew a thing or two about Mr. Ye's methods. If Mr. Yi found out about what happened today, even if she didn't die, she would be skinned alive. Zhou Chongguang nodded. "I know." He heard what Gu Mei said to him. He knew that Gu Mei was Yi Muyun's subordinate and he didn't want to implicate her. Gu Mei nodded and pushed the door open. She didn't close it. Zhou Chongguang stood by the door and saw Cher from afar. She was lying on the hospital bed. Her face was a little pale, but she wasn't in bad spirits. He looked at her and his eyes felt a little warm. They hadn't seen each other for a few days and he realized that he didn't just want to see her. He really wanted to tell her that he liked her. Even if she didn't reply, he wanted her to know. But his rationality still won over his emotions. In the end, he still resisted. After looking for a long time, he still turned around and left quietly. But he didn't leave New York. He was still near the hospital. Occasionally, he would have the chance to see her again. At that time, Gu Mei would push her out to bask in the sun. He didn't know if Gu Mei had discovered his existence, but he did see her for 2 consecutive days. He watched her smile, watched her in a daze, watched as he didn't exist in her world. Yi Muyun stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in the office on the top floor of Boyd New York Company. There were some photos scattered on the floor, all of which were taken at the hospital. Unbeknownst to Cher, she and Zhou Chongguang were in the same frame. Yi Muyun stood there for a long time, then slowly walked back to his desk, opened the drawer, and opened a document. It was information on Glory Enterprise. His slender fingers clenched as he dialed an internal line. "Come here for a moment." In less than 2 minutes, Gu Zhe walked in and stepped on a photo. He picked it up and was shocked. In the photo, not only were Zhou Chongguang and Cher, there was also Gu Mei. It was easy to understand the cause and effect. Gu Zhe's fingers trembled slightly. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles almost turned white. Looking up, he said, "Mr. Yi, Gu Mei is young and immature. Please forgive her this once." Yi Muyun sat behind the desk and looked at Gu Zhe quietly. "Gu Mei is immature. As her brother, you should know how to make up for her mistake." He lowered his gaze and landed on the document on the desk. "Take a look at this document." He paused for a moment, then said softly, "I want Glory Enterprise to disappear within a month." Gu Zhe broke out in a cold sweat. If it wasn't for Gu Mei, he would have been able to persuade Yi Muyun to take back his order. However, he didn't have a position now. He had no other choice but to obey. Yes, Mr. Yi. Gu Zhe sighed in his heart. He didn't say anything else and took the document away. A bloodbath was about to happen in B City, but New York was peaceful at the moment. Chapter 2012. The black Porsche stopped slowly. Yi Muyun got off the car and closed the door. He walked towards the lawn. Yi Muyun saw a tall and skinny figure standing far away, but Yi Muyun acted as though he didn't see him, walking straight towards Gu Mei and Xuan. Cher was sitting in a wheelchair, her legs were fine. She was looking at a few butterflies flying around in the flowers. They were very cute. Yi Muyun walked over naturally and leaned forward to kiss her little mouth. Although the kiss was sudden and Gu Mei was there, he deepened the kiss after she resisted for a while. He pinched her little chin with his palm and forced her to kiss him. Snow had always been afraid of his kisses, but she was shamefully fond of them. Kissing and kissing like this, it was a little too much. She couldn't help wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing her body against his, making it easier for him to deepen the kiss. Gu Mei felt helpless at the side, but she felt more sympathy. Sympathy for Zhou Chongguang, who saw his goddess kissing someone else, and the kiss was so deep. She didn't know that the matter was exposed. She didn't know that her brother was about to kill the family of the person she liked. At this time, Gu Mei was still full of happiness. Even if she liked someone, she felt relaxed in her heart because she had never thought of getting it. She looked to the side inadvertently and saw Zhou Chongguang's face. That face, that expression, Gu Mei would never forget it in her life. Because it was so clean and pure, but it was stained with deep despair. Even a fool could see that Cher was willing. She liked Yi Muyun's kiss. She liked Yi Muyun kissing her. That scene was so beautiful that it made people feel ashamed. Gu Mei's eyes fell on Zhou Chongguang all the time, watching him fall into deep disappointment and despair. Her lips moved, but she didn't say a word in the end. And Yi Muyun carried Cher horizontally and said to Gu Mei in a low voice, "Go through the discharge procedures." Gu Mei was stunned for a moment. And Yi Muyun had already strode towards the hospital parking lot. Wasn't she going to be discharged tomorrow morning? Gu Mei thought in confusion. At that moment, her phone rang. It was Gu Zhe. She immediately picked it up and her eyes fell on Zhou Chongguang's face. At this moment he was also looking at her. Gu Mei's face was slightly hot, but after a while, the blood in her body froze. "Gu Mei, Mr. Ye's private plane will take off in an hour." Gu Zhe's voice was serious. "I know Zhou Chongguang is in the hospital. If you see him, tell him that Mr. Yi is going to deal with Rongguang." This was the only thing he could do for Gu Mei. With just one photo, he could tell that the way Gu Mei looked at Zhou Chongguang was meaningful. He thought about it again and decided to tell her, even if it would make it difficult for him to destroy the Zhou family. Gu Mei immediately understood the meaning behind Gu Zhe's words. She was stunned for a moment before muttering, "Mr. Yi asked brother to do this? Is it because of me?" Gu Zhe didn't deny it. He just sighed. "Gu Mei, you're very smart. You should know what to do." At this time, it was most important to protect himself. Mr. Ye's attitude was very obvious. He wanted him to make it clear to her. Gu Zhe sighed in his heart. This time, Gu Mei was willful and didn't care about the overall situation. Gu Mei was silent for a long time before she said softly, "Brother, can I beg you not to deal with the Zhou family?" Chapter 2013. Gu Mei pursed her lips and didn't say anything for a long time. Gu Zhe couldn't stop worrying about his sister. His voice was calm as he said, "You know what to do. Unless you don't want to live well." Gu Mei's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't help but say, "Brother, I don't know." She muttered to herself, "But is it wrong to like someone?" With that, she immediately hung up the phone. Her expression was a little stern. Then, she set Gu Zhe as a user that was not allowed to contact. She quickly turned on her laptop, entered a set of accounts, and downloaded some information. As she did all this, her fingers were trembling, because she knew how terrible the consequences of betraying Mr. Yi would be. But when she did all this, she didn't hesitate. She didn't have the time to hesitate either. On the other end, Gu Zhe looked at his phone and was stunned. Then he immediately dialed Gu Mei's number, but Gu Mei's phone was no longer in the service area. Damn it, Gu Zhe cursed softly. He almost dropped the phone in his hand and immediately set off to look for Gu Mei. But he couldn't find Gu Mei. He sent her countless messages, asking her to pick up the phone, but they were like stones in the ocean. Gu Zhe understood Gu Mei. They were siblings after all. He always knew what she had done in Boi. He quickly checked the company's information and found traces of theft. Gu Zhe was shocked. He drove all over New York but couldn't find Gu Mei. His heart slowly sank. He had no choice but to follow Yi Muyun back to B City. But Gu Mei had disappeared. Out of selfishness, Gu Zhe didn't tell Yi Muyun about Gu Mei stealing the company's information. He knew that Gu Mei had returned to B City and was most likely with Zhou Chongguang. So he had to stop her before she did anything wrong. Before boarding the plane, Yi Muyun asked about Gu Mei. Gu Zhe said that Gu Mei would return to B City first. When the private plane landed, Gu Zhe immediately returned home to look for Gu Mei, but Gu Mei was still nowhere to be found. He knew that Mr. Yi was already suspicious. Although he didn't say it explicitly, Yi Muyun already knew it with his insight. However, Mr. Yi didn't know that Gu Mei had taken away the documents. This was like a time bomb in Gu Zhe's heart. On the second week after returning to B City, Cher had returned to her normal routine. At first, she went to class, but Gu Mei was not by her side. Instead, another girl followed her. Cher recognized that it was another female employee in the company. Although she was dissatisfied, she didn't lose her temper because she couldn't find fault with the girl. Yi Muyun picked her up after school that day. When Cher opened the car door and got into the car, the girl named Linya left by herself. After getting into the car, Cher pouted unhappily. Yi Muyun placed one hand on the steering wheel and looked at her calmly. "You like Gu Mei a lot." "I can't say that I like her that much, but she was the one who kept me company in New York. I'm quite used to it," Cher said weakly. Yi Muyun looked at her with a burning gaze. After looking at her for a while, he said slowly, "Then I've been with you for so long. Shouldn't you be more used to it?" Cher looked at him pitifully. Her voice was also soft. "That's different." Yi Muyun started the car. "What's different?" After a pause, he said, "Fasten your seatbelt." Chapter 2014. Yi Muyun looked at the road ahead with a faint smile and suddenly held her little hand. Cher's hand tightened, and she felt a little uncomfortable as if she had been electrocuted. However, she didn't dare to break free and just stared at him. Yi Muyun kept holding her hand. Her heart was pounding for a long time. About a minute later, his voice was clear and cold as he asked, "Are you used to it now?" Cher's voice was a little flustered. She then turned her head and looked at him with her heart racing. Yi Muyun's fingers tightened and his smile deepened. He asked again, "Are you used to it?" Under his superior attitude, Cher lowered her face and said in a low voice, "I'm used to it." "Just used to it?" He put on an even more pretentious attitude. "Nothing else?" The little girl lowered her face even more, and after a while, she murmured, "I like Big Brother." He snorted. "I didn't hear you." Cher was furious. Her voice wasn't soft. He must have deliberately said that she couldn't hear it. So she grabbed his hand and bit it hard. But she was really too weak. Even if she used all her strength, she couldn't move him at all. He just lowered his head and looked at her. Then he chuckled. Hearing him laugh, Cher was even angrier. She let go of his hand and ignored him. However, Yi Muyun was fast. He put his finger next to her little teeth and forced her to bite it, teasing her. Cher was almost crying. In the end, she bit her lip and said weakly, "I like Big Brother." At that moment, his sports car drove into the villa's yard, and he let go of her hand. However, when the car stopped, he unbuckled his seatbelt and looked at the little girl beside him. She refused to get out of the car. Yi Muyun unbuckled her seatbelt and said tenderly, "Why aren't you getting out, baby?" Cher turned her face to the side. "You're bullying me." Her face was indescribably red, and she refused to look at him. He looked at her and seemed to understand what she was thinking. He said in a low voice, "Are you shy?" She didn't say anything, so he pulled her face to his side and forced her to look at him. Her shy look was really cute. He gently pinched her chin and leaned over to kiss her. He kissed her lightly and coaxed her to open her mouth. The kiss was very lingering. After a while, he ended the kiss and kissed her eyelids. "Baby, it's okay. Open your eyes." She didn't want to. She hugged his waist like a rascal and stayed in his arms. Yi Muyun had no choice but to carry her out of the car. He carried her horizontally as he kissed her. So delicate. It was just a kiss. She was so shy. If they had sex in the future, she wouldn't want to see anyone. What about the future? He murmured against her lips. Just teasing her like this made him incomparably happy. He kissed her again and again, calling her a little fool. Cher was angry. "I'm not a little fool." He carried her all the way to the main house. He didn't put her down even when Sister Lee came over. He just said calmly, "Dinner will be served at 6:30." With that said, he carried the little girl to the study on the second floor. Sister Lee smiled happily as she watched the young master and young mistress go upstairs. Chapter 2015. Being hugged by him like that, Cher only dared to hit him lightly. Her voice was as soft as a mosquito's. "Put me down." She was not used to him hugging her in front of others. At home, even though everyone knew about their relationship, she had always called him brother. It was a little strange to hug him like that. Yi Muyun chuckled softly. "I'm not letting go." Not only did he hug her, but he even lowered his head and kissed her. He kissed her gently on the lips. Every time he kissed her, her body would soften and heat up. She could not help but tremble as though she was being electrocuted. Cher's little hands hugged his shoulders. Her fingers brushed past his expensive shirt and gripped it tightly. She was so afraid, burying herself in his arms like a weak animal, allowing him to bully her as he pleased. In the end, he bullied her too harshly. Perhaps it was because he was too beastly, as he imitated the act of kissing her, back and forth. Cher did not understand why he was doing that. She only felt that his heartbeat had sped up a lot, and his body temperature was burning up. She moaned, but her moans were all swallowed by him. This kiss was so ferocious that it almost drowned her. He had never kissed her like that before. In the end, she was placed on the study table and kissed. Her petite body started to heat up slowly, and he did not just kiss her. He did something else. Cher was so scared that she cried out softly, "Light the lamp." In the evening, the lights in the study room were brightly lit. As her brother bullied her like that, she cried out miserably. Yi Muyun was very distressed, but at the last moment he still let her go. He was still standing. That little person was curled up in his arms, her little hand hanging around his neck like a rascal. She snorted softly. "Brother, you're bad." He bullied her almost every day now. She did not know why he liked to do that. Clearly, he did not seem to be feeling well at the end. He often went to the washroom, and that. Why did he have to do something so uncomfortable over and over again? Cher could not figure it out, but she did not dare to ask. She could only let him bully her. At this moment, she was crying hard, and her little body was hot. She didn't understand what was going on with herself, but Yi Muyun knew. He reached out to help her pull up her clothes and chuckled softly, "I only like to bully my little idiot. I'm not stupid." She emphasized once again. Yi Muyun laughed again. "Are you stupid?" His voice was extremely seductive. "How stupid is my little fool?" She was furious. "Little idiot, I don't want to talk to you anymore." As soon as he said that, he felt like biting his tongue. It was too embarrassing. Yi Muyun kissed her little face. "Silly girl." She was so angry that she cried out. He couldn't help but kiss and rub her. After a while, he finally couldn't help himself and went to the bathroom. Beloved lay on the small sofa, trembling. When he came out, she was still curled up there and had not come back to her senses. Yi Muyun sat over and pinched her soft little face. He called her silly girl again with infinite love and picked her up again. Today, it seemed that he was not going to let go of her and was going to hug her until he fell asleep. Chapter 2016. Although Cher had a problem with it, she didn't dare to tell him. Especially since she had a request tonight, she wouldn't resist whatever he wanted to do. After eating downstairs, she finished her homework obediently and looked up at Yi Myun, who was behind the desk. He was handling work, and his gaze was focused. "Brother," she called out to him timidly, her voice strangely seductive. Yi Myun looked up at her and smiled. "What's wrong?" The little girl took the initiative to walk over and sit beside him, looking very obedient. He waited quietly, knowing what she was thinking. "Brother," she called out to him softly. Before she said it, she wrung her hands and said after a long time, "I want Gumei to accompany me." He reached out to touch her little head and sighed. "Isn't this good?" "It's not bad, but I like Gumei more." It was rare for Cher to beg him. She even took the initiative to sit on his lap and kissed his chin. She was very inexperienced in doing such things, but she knew that he liked it. She gnawed on the food in a disorderly manner like a puppy, but she succeeded in provoking his anger. However, Yi Myun still let her kiss him. He looked at her beautiful face quietly for a long time before he hugged her and kissed her deeply. He kissed her deeply. She was quite obedient at first, but she wasn't very cooperative towards the end and kept asking him to stop. "No." Her voice was soft. "Brother, I want Gumei." After saying that, she looked at him shyly with tears in her eyes, angry that he didn't want her. There was a strange look in Yi Myun's eyes. His fingers caressed her red lips gently. After a long time, he said lightly, "Gumei is a top talent. It's just temporary." He smiled and teased her. "It's a waste of my talent to accompany you to study." With that said, he rubbed her hair again. "Be good, and I won't let anyone follow you from now on." Compared to spending time with Gumei, the fact that there was no one watching them was a bigger temptation. Thus, the little girl immediately betrayed her friendship and asked pitifully, "When will I stop following you?" Hearing her question, his gaze deepened. After a long time, he said softly, "After your birthday?" Her birthday was only a few days away. Did Cher think this had anything to do with it? She didn't know that he was going to eat her on her birthday. After that, he wouldn't have to worry about her running away. She opened her round eyes as if she had some doubts. As a black-bellied man, Yi Myun naturally would not tell her his dark thoughts. In order to divert her attention, he kissed her again until she was so tired that she almost fell asleep. After she fell asleep, he took a shower and returned to the study. He dialed a number and asked in a gloomy voice, "Guzei, have you found Gumei yet?" Guzei was silent for a moment before he said, "She might be in a bad mood." Yi Myun narrowed his eyes. "I heard that she's in City B." Guzei didn't say anything else. "From tomorrow onwards, Boyi's database will be locked. Also, Guzei, don't ask about anything else except for the acquisition of glory." Yi Myun's voice was cold. Guzei wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't have the chance to say a word. Chapter 2017. Guzei clearly knew that Mr. Yi had taken away his authority. If Glory Enterprise couldn't be acquired or killed, his position as Guzei's special assistant would probably come to an end. But between power and family, Guzei still chose family. However, this didn't mean that he had betrayed Mr. Yi. He was just waiting for Gumei to turn back. He spent a week on the preliminary work for Glory Enterprise, and it would take about half a month to destroy this century-old family business, if Gumei didn't show up. On the other side, Yi Myun hung up the phone and walked back to the bedroom. The little girl was still lying there, sweet and carefree. He sat on the bed and reached out to gently touch her cheek. He smiled gently, then lifted the quilt and lay down beside her. He pulled the warm little girl into his arms and kissed her. He smelled the milk fragrance for a while, then closed his eyes and fell asleep. Early in the morning, when Cher woke up, she was rolling in his arms. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw his handsome face magnified. Cher blushed and looked at him eagerly. "Good morning, brother." In the morning, Yi Myun had a kind of laziness that was different from usual. His black hair was slightly messy, and the collar of his pajamas was open, revealing his delicate collarbone. She stared at his beautiful chin in a daze, and further up, at his sexy thin lips. She stared straight at him. Yi Muyun hugged her onto his body, and his voice was a little hoarse. "You want to kiss me?" The little girl sat in his arms, extremely shy. She had always been afraid of him, and she was even more afraid of him in bed. Now that they were in such a situation, she naturally refused, so she lay in his arms and refused. He coaxed her for a long time, then his little girl moved her trembling lips to his face and kissed him lightly. When she took the initiative to kiss him, he usually wouldn't kiss her. He liked to see her shy look, to see the expression on her face when she leaned forward to kiss him. It had to be said that Yi Muyun was only 20 years old, but other than the cruelty of the business world, he had also learned some of the bad habits of men. He didn't touch women outside, but he came back to bully young girls. At this moment, she was kissing him. His gaze was almost burning her. She said softly, "Close your eyes." Not only did he not close his eyes, he even demanded that she open her eyes as well. It was too embarrassing. Little Milk Bun couldn't take it anymore and refused to kiss him anymore. She just lay down and hugged him shamelessly, refusing to let go. Yi Muyun smiled and let her go. He got up and went to the bathroom. Cher heard a shameful voice coming from the other side. She covered her ears and refused to listen. He was so shameless. Beast. After a while, the beast slowly walked out. His eyes fell on her face and he smiled faintly. He began to take off his pajamas and change. Cher covered her little face again and ran to the bathroom with a red face. She even closed the door. The corner of Yi Muyun's lips curled up slightly. But the little girl immediately regretted it after closing the door because the smell in the bathroom was really... Her face turned even redder, and her heart beat faster. Don't go out to change clothes after showering. She didn't expect that Yi Muyun hadn't left yet. He suddenly walked in while she was in the changing room. "Brother." She reached out to cover her body and looked at him eagerly. "Aren't you going downstairs?" Chapter 2018. His expression was gentle, as though he was a husband taking care of his wife. They were so young, standing together in the morning light. It was the most beautiful and innocent time of their lives. Even though they got together later on, they would never have such innocent times again. Cher resisted at first, but perhaps his gaze was too gentle, so she didn't try to escape. She cooperated with him and put on her clothes. She could vaguely feel that he treated her differently. She couldn't tell what was different. It was the same love, but it was different. There was something in his gaze that she didn't understand. She was conflicted at first, but she didn't think about it anymore. In her heart, she had already agreed to be with him. Even though she was afraid of him, she never thought that another man would appear in her life to replace him. She didn't resist, not because she obeyed him, but because she obeyed her own heart. The 18-year-old girl was always a little enlightened. When she looked at him, her heart was slowly stirred up by some deep feelings. "Brother," the little girl called out softly. There was an inexplicable hint of love in her voice. Yi Muyun reached out and ruffled her hair. He bent down to be eye level with her. Cher blushed as she looked at his elegant face. "After your birthday, call me Muyun, He smiled slightly and kissed her on the lips. Cher was still in a daze. After a long time she asked, "Why?" He sighed in his heart and ruffled her hair again. "Because we will be engaged. Our relationship will be different in the future." This was the first time he said this to her. Cher was a little surprised. She let out an ah and then her mouth was slightly agape. She couldn't speak for a long time. Her expression was especially cute. Not willing. His voice was gentle. He didn't act like a superior like before. Or perhaps he had entered a new way of interacting with her. In his heart, he had already treated her as his little wife. Cher covered her face with her hands. Only then did she realize that this was the reason why his attitude had changed these few days. She slowly put her hands down and looked up at him. He was so good-looking. She was afraid of him, but she really liked him. She bit her lips and after a long time, she lowered her eyes and spat out a few soft words, "I'm not unwilling." In this short minute, Yi Muyun experienced the greatest ecstasy in the world. His body was almost stiff as he kept looking at her. After a long time, he slowly held her in his arms. His movements were unbelievably gentle, as if he was carrying a fragile treasure. Cher buried her head in his arms. After a long time, she called out softly, "Mu-yun." But after saying it, she felt awkward and asked in a small voice, "Can I still call you brother?" He lowered his head to look at her. She looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. Sighing, he reached out to stroke her little head. "Let's talk about it later." She was only 2 years younger than him. But his excessive protection made her look like a child. He really shouldn't expect too much from her. He pressed his forehead against hers and stayed like that for a while before carrying her downstairs for breakfast. Sister Lee looked at the young master and young mistress. They were different from before. Her heart was filled with joy and she kept persuading them to eat more. Cher's little face was blushing. Chapter 2019. Yi Muyun pinched her soft face and smiled. "Let's go pick out a dress and an engagement ring." Engagement ring? Cher's heart pounded again. Was he really going to get engaged? Why did she feel that it was unreal? She was only 18 years old, and she was going to get engaged? While she was in a daze, Sister Lee said happily, "That's great. I'll ask someone to decorate young master's bedroom in 2 days. It'll be more cozy." The layout of the Pei garden was very simple. It was a 4-story villa. Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi lived on the 3rd floor, while Yi Muyun and Cher lived on the 2nd floor. However, the master bedroom was for Yi Muyun. The meaning couldn't be clearer. Young Master Yi would inherit the Tang family in the future, including Mississippi. Sister Lee was very happy. She was already thinking that there might be a little miss or young master to hug in a year or 2. Seeing that young Master Yi was full of vigor, she was afraid that he wouldn't be able to control himself sooner or later. Sister Lee was experienced. How could she not know that young master was in a hurry to get engaged? It was probably because young master couldn't control himself anymore. Without a title, young master wouldn't do anything. With a title, everything would be a matter of course. She said it so blatantly. The little idiot in Boss Ye's family understood and hurriedly said, "No need, no need." She couldn't finish her words because her little hand was held by him. Yi Muyun looked up at Sister Lee and smiled. "Then I'll have to trouble Sister Lee." He was going to ask someone to design it and redecorate it, especially to hang their photos. "How can you say that?" After Sister Lee left, the little girl bit her lips. "You will misunderstand." He looked at her little face and smiled, then said slowly, "It's not a misunderstanding." At this time, he was holding her and feeding her milk. He said slowly, "Because I'm going to live together after I get engaged." The little girl was a little absent-minded. "We are living together now. We'll have sex." He said simply, without any hesitation or beating around the bush. Xuenya was stunned, staring at him blankly. He sighed and called her a little fool. Then, he pulled her into his arms and whispered into her ears, "I want you. The complete and utter kind." Xuer blinked and subconsciously called out, "Big brother?" He nibbled on her little ear and whispered a few words to her. Her little face turned red and she buried herself in his arms, refusing to come out. And he was smiling very happily, as if he had never been so happy before. After breakfast, he drove her to school. When she got off the car, Yi Muyun got off with her and stopped her. "Wait a minute." Xuer stood still, her eyes sparkling as she looked into his eyes. He walked around the front of the car. Right in front of the crowded school entrance, he held her little face and kissed it. His voice was a little hoarse. "After we get engaged, we'll take half a year off from school and—" Cher's voice was a little dazed. "Huh." He chuckled. "I'm going to the French branch for half a year." He was still holding her little face. "You don't want to go?" Cher didn't know where she got the courage from, but she resisted in a low voice. "I don't want to be luggage." He smiled and pinched her soft cheeks. "You're the accompanying family member. How can you be luggage?" Accompanying family member. Those words made her blush again. She didn't know how many times she had blushed today. She pursed her lips and nodded. Chapter 2020. Yi Muyun smiled and kissed her on the forehead again before letting her in. He opened the door and got in the car, leaving B University slowly. Cher walked into the school. She was in a good mood because she didn't have any followers. She was even a little excited. She felt that everything was wonderful and she was especially happy. She had almost forgotten about the unpleasantness between them. When she arrived at the classroom, she walked over and sat down. Zheng Xini, who was sitting beside her, forced a smile. "You're here." Cher nodded. Seeing that Zheng Xini's gaze was still on her face, she hesitated for a moment before saying, "I'm getting engaged in a few days." Zheng Xini was shocked and just stared at her. Cher smiled. "It's true. So you don't have to worry about me and Zhou Chongguang. It's not about you and him." Zheng Xini's voice was anxious and fast. That's because, before she could finish, a slender figure stood at the classroom door. "Classmate Zheng, come here for a moment." Zheng Xini was stunned for a moment and then looked at Zhou Chongguang in a daze. It had only been a few days, but he had lost a lot of weight. The school knew about what happened to Zhou Chongguang's family. As for the one who bought glory, there were rumors that it was Boy. And the only one who had a grudge against the Zhou family in Boyi was the high and mighty Mr. Yi. So when Zheng Xini heard the news, she couldn't help but want to ask Tang Cher about it. She was the instigator, and she should be responsible for it. Now that she was interrupted by Zhou Chongguang, she was unhappy. She felt that Zhou Chongguang was not worth it, but she was in no position to say anything. Cher looked at the people inside and outside the door suspiciously. She realized that everyone was looking at her in a strange way, and her good mood was instantly gone. She didn't say anything, but picked up a book to write and draw. Zheng Xini couldn't take it anymore. She looked at Zhou Chongguang and said in a sharp voice, "Zhou Chongguang, take a good look at the kind of girl you like. Your family is like that, but she can still draw peacefully. She doesn't have a heart." Her sharp words seemed to have broken a spell. Everyone stopped moving. Some things, when exposed, are usually very ugly, just like now. Zhou Chongguang's face was pale. He narrowed his eyes and grabbed Zheng Xini's arm. He dragged her out and said, "Don't say another word. It's not her fault." After Zheng Xini said it, she didn't intend to take it back. She was dragged away by Zhou Chongguang, but she still said angrily, "Why didn't you let me say it? It's clearly because of her that your family is facing bankruptcy. Look at her, she's like a little idiot who doesn't know anything. Actually, she's the cruelest because she only loves herself. No one else loves her." Zheng Xini was satisfied, but she was slapped in the face. Zhou Chongguang's face looked terrible, and his voice was hoarse. "I told you not to say it." Zheng Xini covered her face. After a while, she asked softly, "You hit me?" "Zhou Chongguang, you know that I like you. If you like someone, they have no obligation to like you." Zhou Chongguang's tone was very indifferent. "It's just like how I treat Tang Cher. She has no obligation to like me." Zheng Xini was stunned for a long time before she chuckled. "Zhou Chongguang, you're so silly. Now you can only save your family's business by telling her the truth." Chapter 2021. Cher finally understood. There was something wrong with Zhou Chongguang's family business? And it had something to do with her brother? She looked at Zhou Chongguang for a long while before asking softly, "Is it true?" Zhou Chongguang looked straight into her eyes and said indifferently, "I've said it before. This has nothing to do with you." Cher pursed her lips and said nothing more. She packed her bag and walked out quickly. Without thinking twice, Zhou Chongguang broke away from Zheng Xini's hand and went up to grab hold of Cher. "Where are you going?" "It has nothing to do with you." Cher's voice was slightly cold. "Move aside." She had never been so cold to anyone before. But from now on, she could not get close to Zhou Chongguang anymore. Her heart was thumping wildly, but she still put on a calm front. Right then, Zheng Xini went up again and looked at Zhou Chongguang. "Don't stop her. I think she'll pay for her mistake. And you're innocent." Zhou Chongguang spun his head around fiercely, his gentlemanly face filled with indignation. "What did she do wrong again? Do you have to target her like this?" Zheng Xini's face looked a little embarrassed. After a while, she chuckled out softly. That's right. She didn't do anything at all. It's because she has a good brother that she could get first place even if she failed her exams. Zheng Xinyi's expression was a little crazy, as though she was going to throw caution to the wind. But no matter what, the school still took away your first place. A fake is a fake. When she said that, she thought that Cher would be embarrassed. However, Cher laughed out instead. Looking at Zheng Xinyi's confident yet self-abased face, she chuckled and said softly, "Do you know why you got first place again in the end? Do you think it's because you're excellent?" Cher chuckled. Or did the school leaders find their conscience? She had never been so sharp before, but looking at Zheng Xinyi's confused expression, she felt extremely happy. "That's because I begged my good brother to give you the first place." Zheng Xinyi's face suddenly turned pale, and she was extremely embarrassed. However, Cher was not done yet. She continued, "Zheng Xinyi, believe it or not, as long as I don't make things easy for you, your grades will never be in the top 10 of the grade." This meant that her excellence would not be recognized. Zheng Xinyi was very clear about the blow to herself. And scholarships. She needed them. The two of them, who had shed all pretense of cordiality, stood face to face, no longer as close as they used to be. "You're despicable and shameless," Zheng Xinyi said after a long time. Cher's lips curled into a beautiful smile. "Compared to you who turned yourself into such a hateful person for the sake of a man, I'm nothing." As she said that, she turned around and walked outside. As she walked, she said in a calm and crisp voice, "From now on, Zheng Xinyi, if you interfere in Zhou Chongguang's matters again, I can guarantee that you will disappear from City B." With that, the surrounding students were stunned. In the past, although Tang Cher came from a noble family, she had always been a naive and sweet girl. She did not speak and was gentle and quiet. Unexpectedly, that was not the case at all. There were already people whispering, "How could a child from such a family be naive and sweet?" Chapter 2022. Look, this is the aura of a wealthy family. Zheng Xinyi is far from it, someone said secretly. Many people agreed. But Cher didn't care about this. She quickly disappeared into the hallway of the school building. Zhou Chongguang's expression was ugly as he left slowly. Zheng Xinyi stood there awkwardly, so she had regained her first place because Cher had backed down, not because the school valued her. How ridiculous was that? At that moment, Zheng Xinyi realized the importance of power. One day, she would climb to the top of the pyramid. Cher walked out of the school and hailed a taxi. Half an hour later, she arrived at the headquarters of Boyi. All the employees there knew her. Seeing her, they escorted her up. Gu Zhe was a little surprised to see her. Then he smiled and said, "Mr. Yi is in a meeting. Do you want to wait in his office?" Cher looked at him. Her voice was a little stiff. "I want to see him right now." With that, she walked to the door of the conference room and pushed it open. Gu Zhe didn't stop her, because the consequences would be worse if he did. Obviously, the little princess of the Tang family was going to lose her temper. When Cher pushed the door open, Yi Muyun was in the middle of the meeting. He was stunned when he saw the little person at the door. Then, Mr. Yi was in a daze. His secretary reminded him softly, "Mr. Yi?" Then, her incorruptible Mr. Yi stood up and said calmly, "Manager Fong, continue with the meeting." With that, he walked to the door. He took her with one hand and closed the door with the other, closing the room full of gossips. "Why are you here?" The young Mr. Yi held his future wife in his arms and walked slowly to his office. Along the way, they met many people who could see how gentle Mr. Ye's expression was. This was completely different from the iron fist Mr. Yi had in the company. Cher's little face was tense until he took her into his office and let her go. She couldn't help but ask, "What's going on with Glory Enterprise?" Yimyun was pouring tea. When she heard what Mo Tienga said, she smiled lightly. "Why are you asking about this?" He continued to pour the water calmly and passed it to her. His gaze was deep as he said, "You seem to have rushed over. You didn't even attend class?" He suddenly nodded in understanding. "There's no need to attend this class." "Indeed." Cher's heart went up and down. She looked at him and said slowly, "That's not what I'm talking about. It sounds like you're different from before." Yi Muyun looked at the cup in her hand and said calmly, "Drink the water in the cup first." It was rare that Cher didn't listen to him. She was still looking at him. "I don't want to drink. I want to know now. Are you buying Glory Enterprise?" Cher pursed her lips and asked in a low voice. Yi Muyun held the cup in his hand and looked straight at her. His voice was indifferent. "Yes, Gu Zhe is busy with this. What's wrong?" He said it so casually. Cher's eyes widened slightly as she stared at him. "Why do you want to deal with him?" Yi Muyun smiled lightly. He sat on the sofa and looked at Cher as if he was amused. "Why do I want to deal with him?" Cher's little face was still tense. "You know." Chapter 2023. Cher couldn't find any fault with him. She bit her lip and said, "Can you not do it?" "Not do it?" He smiled. "Of course I can, but I can't do it for the company's benefit." Er's attitude softened. She slowly walked to his side and hugged his arm. "Big brother, just think of it as doing this for me, okay?" Yi Muyun looked at her deeply and asked her softly, "Do you think it's appropriate for you to beg me for someone else's sake?" As he spoke, he gently pinched her little face, but there was no sign of anger. Cher turned her face away. "You know it's not like that." "Then what is it?" His voice was full of tension, which scared her. "Is it because you're guilty?" She turned her head again and looked at him with wide eyes. She was no match for him. He had grasped her weakness and could coax her with a few words. "Be good. This is not a child's play. It's not my decision to buy Glory." Cher didn't believe him. Yi Muyun looked at her and smiled. He suddenly walked to the desk and pressed the intercom. "Gu Zhe, come here." In less than 2 minutes, Gu Zhe came. "Tell her about the process of the company's decision to buy Glory." Yi Muyun's voice was indifferent. Gu Zhe smiled. "I was the one who suggested it." Then Gu Zhe made up a story. It was so perfect that even Yi Muyun couldn't help looking at him. It was Gu Zhe's loss not to go to the Chinese Academy of Drama. Cher was stunned. Had she wronged him? Wasn't it her brother's idea to buy Glory? She was a little stunned and couldn't come back to her senses for a long time. Yi Muyun gestured for Gu Zhe to go out first. After the door was closed, he got up and pulled the little girl into his arms. "You're not angry anymore?" Cher was still in a trance. After a long time she said, "Then, can I?" In the end, she was not confident and her voice was soft. He sighed. "Baby, I can't." He caressed her long hair and said in a hoarse voice, "Listen to me, okay? This has nothing to do with you. That's how the business world is. The strong prey on the weak." She had no room to say anything else. She couldn't make a fuss in the company over this matter. Although she was young, she knew this. Originally, he wanted to leave. He didn't care where he was going, he just wanted to leave. But since she was here, how could he bear to let her go? "Let's have lunch together. I'll send you to school in the afternoon." He pinched her little nose. "You're so angry." Cher was a little unhappy at the thought of going to school. She snorted softly. "I offended someone at school." Naturally, he had to ask. When she said it, Yi Muyun smiled faintly. "If you don't want to see anyone, tell me. It's not that serious, but am I too arrogant?" She raised her little face and asked him. He caressed her long hair and chuckled. "Our Cher deserves to be arrogant." With that, he held her little face and kissed her. At first, it was a gentle kiss, but then it became a little fierce. She stumbled and fell on the sofa, and his body was soon on top of hers. Chapter 2024. This kiss slowly changed its flavor. At first, Cher resisted. But later on, she hooked her fair arms around his neck and curled her feet up shyly. Her fair and tender legs were extremely alluring. "Cher, I can't help it anymore." At this moment, other than his desire for her, there was a lot of darkness in his heart. He was afraid that one day she would find out that he was not as perfect as he looked. At this moment, he wanted to get her so badly that she would be his. But in the end, she was still too young. He could not bear to, but he did not go through with it. In the end, he was just one step away, on the sofa in the office. The coffee-colored sofa was a mess. It was almost unbearable. Cher closed her eyes slightly and panted. She did not dare to look at him. Yi Muyun was not any better. His breathing was messy. He exhaled with difficulty and hugged her carefully in his arms. He helped her button up one by one. Cher nestled in his arms and bit her lips. When she called out to him, it was a little flirtatious. "Brother." He knew that she wanted to beg him again. He smiled faintly. "Other than this, I can agree to anything else." Cher lowered her head. After a while, she said, "I got it." He did not agree. So, the little girl was not happy during lunch. But she did not beg him anymore. In the afternoon, he sent her to school personally. She did not know that when she went to the classroom, Yi Muyun went to the office. When Cher went to class, everyone in the class looked at her strangely. She didn't mind it at all as she walked back to her seat. She drew, and slept. Everything was the same as before. Her mental fortitude is unparalleled. This is natural pride. Zheng Xini is far from it. A female classmate laughed. She laughed at Zheng Xini's wishful thinking. Why did she have to go against Tang Cher for Zhou Chongguang? No matter how outstanding Zhou Chongguang was, to put it bluntly, he would not marry someone like Zheng Xini. One must know that men were visual creatures. A woman like Zheng Xini was simply unattractive. Now that she had offended Tang Cher, they guessed that Zheng Xini would not be able to survive in school. After a while, Zheng Xini was called to the office by the teacher. When she came back, her face was full of anger. Because the school leaders actually wanted her to stay one grade back. The point was that she was only in her first year. Where could she stay? To put it bluntly, he wanted her to avoid Tang Cher and not make Tang Cher feel uncomfortable. Repeating a year was the mildest way. If she was unwilling, she would have to quit school. Zheng Xini was angry and made a scene in the office, but it was useless. No one listened to her. When she saw Tang Cher lying there drawing, she felt a surge of anger in her heart. She walked over and said coldly, "Are you satisfied now?" Shui looked up at her. Zheng Xini scoffed coldly. "I've stayed one grade back. Are you satisfied now?" Cher seemed to have understood it. However, she did not show any goodwill towards Zheng Xini. Instead, she chuckled. "I've never liked Zhou Chongguang. I really don't know where your hostility towards me comes from. If you don't like him, why did you send him to the infirmary?" Zheng Xini asked aggressively. Cher lowered her gaze. "Have you forgotten? You were the one who dragged me to watch the game. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been hit by the ball." Everyone looked at Zheng Xini with a strange gaze as they whispered among themselves. Chapter 2025. Sometimes you have to pay the price if you want to take advantage of others. Cher looked at her. "Not everything is taken advantage of by you, right?" Zheng Xini glared at her fiercely. "So this is your true face? What true colors?" Cher mocked. "Do I have to count the money for you after you sell me out? Is that what you call being kind?" As she spoke, Cher packed up her books, slung her backpack over her shoulder and left. She walked straight to Zhou Chongguang's classroom. She wanted to find Zhou Chongguang, just to make things clear to him. There had never been anything between them. She would bear what she should bear, but she wouldn't admit what she shouldn't. But Zhou Chongguang had quit school. Cher was shocked when she heard the news. She stood in the hallway for a long time. She knew that Rongguang couldn't keep his hands on Bo. Although her brother said that it had nothing to do with her, she still felt uneasy and guilty. Zhao Zi looked at Cher and said coldly, "Don't look for him. You'll only hurt him." Cher was stunned for a long time before she looked up. "Doesn't he want to learn piano?" Zhao Zi sneered. "If he can't keep Rongguang now, he won't be able to go to New York to learn piano." "I see." Cher's voice was calm. "Thank you for telling me this." Zhao Zi looked at her back and pursed his lips, but he didn't tell her the truth. A figure appeared next to him. It was Zhou Chongguang, who had disappeared with a paper box in his hand. "Thank you." Zhou Chongguang's voice was calm, and his eyes fell on the girl in the distance. Zhao Zi looked at him and said nervously, "Are you still thinking about her? Why didn't you tell her that you went to New York?" That's why Rongguang was suppressed. What's the point? Zhou Chongguang smiled helplessly. "Zi, you don't know how Yi Muyun handles things. If you continue to pester her, Rongguang will only die more miserably." Zhao Zi gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Tell her that there's another situation where she can stop Yi Muyun." "We can't stop it, not even her." Zhou Chongguang smiled. "The plan to acquire Rongguang has been implemented, and the funds used should be billions. Even Yi Muyun himself can't treat it as a child's play and stop the acquisition just because he says he doesn't want to. That man, if he was not ambitious, how could he stand at such a height at the age of 20? Zhao Zi fell silent. Zhou Chongguang patted him on the shoulder. "Thank you for today. In the future, don't say anything in front of her. I was the one who pestered her and caused all this." "Chongguang?" Zhao Zi didn't know what to say. Zhou Chongguang closed his eyes. "Zi, look at the sunshine outside. It's so nice. There must be a way." He opened his eyes and looked at Zhao Zi. "I'll think of a way." Even if he had to sacrifice everything, even if he had to destroy the dream in his heart, he couldn't give up on his family. He couldn't care less now. He wanted to stand at the same top as that man. At that time, would he not be forced to give up his dream and the girl he liked? Zhao Zi looked at him and forced a smile. "Chongguang, I hope you can play the guqin again one day." "I will." Zhou Chongguang smiled. "I will, easy." Chapter 2026. In the office on the top floor of Boyi, Yi Muyun sat behind his desk. He looked at his watch and said to his secretary, "Time to get off work." The secretary was smart. She smiled and said, "Mr. Yi, you can buy a bouquet of flowers. Little girls like flowers." Yi Muyun looked at her and didn't say anything. The secretary took out her phone and waved it. "I know a flower shop that has a good bouquet. I'll order it. Can Mr. Yi pick it up when you get off work?" Yi Muyun didn't think and said directly, "Okay." However, he still chose a bouquet of lily of the valley. The secretary ordered, "It'll be ready in half an hour. Mr. Yi can drive by now." Yi Muyun took his coat and went out. The secretary closed the door and heard Mr. Yi calling the little girl, so she went to the elevator on the other side. Yi Muyun dialed Cher's number. She answered quickly, "Brother? Where are you? I'll pick you up." His voice was very gentle, and there was a faint smile on his face. Cher lay on the bed and ate an apple. She grunted slowly, and there was nothing strange in her voice. Yi Muyun hung up the phone with a faint smile and walked out of the elevator. When the car arrived at the flower shop, the shop assistant had already wrapped the flowers. When she handed them to Yi Muyun, she said with a smile, "Lily of the Valley is very suitable for young girls." This probably pleased Yi Muyun. He smiled faintly and put the flowers in the front passenger seat. When he started the car, he looked sideways for a while, and the corners of his mouth curled up. When the sports car drove back to Pay Garden, he got out of the car with the flowers. Sister Lee came over and said softly, "You're back so early. What happened?" Sister Lee was usually very concerned about the young couple, so she couldn't help but be a little worried. They were about to get engaged, so there wouldn't be any more trouble, right? "It's okay." He comforted Sister Lee with a faint smile and walked up the stairs. When he reached the door of her room, he looked at her 2 little feet dangling. The little person was reading a manga, and there was a freshly gnawed apple core on the bedsheet. He couldn't help but laugh. He walked over and lay on his stomach, covering her from behind and kissing her ear. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing." The little girl immediately moved the manga in her hand down, using her body to block him from reading it. Yi Muyun smiled. She held her down with one hand and didn't let her move. Her other hand reached out to take her book. Her book was under her body, so the process was hard to describe. In the end, she gave in and begged with a blushing face, "Big brother." She handed the comic over to him. Yi Muyun sat up and placed the flowers in his hands and her arms. He flipped through the comic with a calm expression and asked indifferently, "Do you like it?" Cher looked at the flowers in her hands and was a little dazed. In the past, he would always give her food, small cakes, desserts, and so on. She really liked it. Whenever she ate, he would watch from the side. This was the first time he had given her flowers like this. She couldn't say whether she liked it or not, but she felt that their relationship was different. They had lived together for more than 10 years. A long time ago, she was like his possession. Now that they had suddenly become engaged, she wasn't used to it, but he seemed to be adapting well. Chapter 2027. Do you like reading this? He asked softly. Men and men. Cher didn't think about anything else, nor did she notice that the man beside her was looking at her like a wolf. Then can you tell me what's with men and women? He asked her like a superior. Cher was dumbfounded. She looked at him and couldn't say anything for a long time. You don't even understand men and women, and you still want to read men and men, huh? He put down the comic in his hand and looked at her. Cher was immediately indignant. She pouted and snorted softly. Then how did you know? Of course I know. He looked down at her. Do you want to try? His voice was calm, but there was a hint of tension in it. Cher was a little scared and stammered, No, I don't think so. She knew that if he said try, he would go through with it. Although they had slept on the same bed before and he liked to kiss and nibble her, he hadn't done it to the end. She heard that the first time was very painful. Cher's face suddenly turned pale. She bit her lip and looked up at him for a long time before she asked softly, Brother, we're engaged. Will you? She couldn't say the rest of the words because it was too embarrassing. Yi Muyun was also stunned. He hadn't expected her to ask him that directly. A moment later, he lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. Baby, don't you want me to do this? She didn't say that she didn't dare to. She lay in his arms for a long time before she asked, Will it hurt a lot? Yi Muyun was startled again. Then she smiled faintly. The first time will probably be very painful. But I'll be gentle. Cher looked up and bit her lips so hard that they were about to bleed. Don't you know how to do it too? Yi Muyun's gaze became a little unfathomable. He held her little face and didn't allow her to escape. He looked into her eyes and asked her softly, Baby, do you want me to do this with others? I'll teach you when I have experience, huh? She shook her head without thinking. She shook her head furiously and hugged his waist. She said in a low voice, That's so dirty. He smiled happily and coaxed her naughtily, Then I'm not dirty. Does that mean the baby will do anything? Cher looked at him blankly, not understanding what he was talking about. Then, Mr. Yi whispered into his future wife's ear, lecturing her naughtily. After listening for a while, the little idiot covered her ears and refused to listen. He was too naughty. Yi Muyun smiled even more happily, stroking her hair and calling her a little fool. He couldn't help kissing her for a while. In the end, he didn't touch her because she was too young. When the two of them lay on their sides, he stroked her little head and said gently, Let's go out for dinner later. I've already ordered dinner. His fingers gently caressed her little hand. Let's go pick out the matching rings together, which... Cher's heart was beating fast as she looked up at him. She still felt that it was a little surreal. Her parents weren't around, and he was the one who decided all these things. However, she couldn't refute him. Perhaps she even felt a little happy. In the midst of her happiness, she still felt a little uneasy. She asked softly, Is there any hope of returning to glory? She even acted coquettishly, hugging his arm and swaying it gently. Brother. Chapter 2028. He pressed her little head into his arms and kissed it. Be good and listen to me. What will happen to Zhou Chongguang if Rongguang is acquired? Cher buried herself in his arms and asked with much difficulty. Actually, she knew that she shouldn't have asked. After all, it would make Zhou Chongguang's life even worse, but she still couldn't help but ask. After asking, she looked at his handsome face. Yi Muyun thought for a while before answering her. His tone was gentle. It won't affect him much. Rongguang will naturally get a sum of money if it's acquired. The Zhou family will still be able to live a carefree life. Cher let out a long breath. If that was the case, she would feel less guilty. She wasn't very familiar with Zhou Chongguang, but she still didn't want him to suffer too much if he was involved in it. Really? She was still worried, so she asked again. When have I ever lied to you? He smiled and asked her in return. Cher replied with an "oh" and didn't say anything else. He pulled her up. All right, let's go out for dinner. Her clothes were suitable, so he didn't waste any time and carried her into the car. Cher thought that he would bring her around first, but she didn't expect that they would go straight to the restaurant. Sitting in the empty restaurant and eating a candlelit French meal, she knew that he had prepared this meticulously. Her little heart was beating fast. Do you like it? He placed a red rose at the tip of her nose and pressed his body against her back. He covered her eyes with his palms. Now guess what I'm going to give you? Cher's heart was beating very fast. She could roughly guess what he wanted to do tonight, but he hadn't said anything. Moreover, she had just experienced those things in the day, so she was feeling a little complicated now. Her entire body was curled up in his arms. She couldn't see anything but the warm breath on his palms. It was as if Yi Muyun was the only one left in the world. At least, in her world, that was the case. I don't know. Her voice was slightly trembling, and he immediately guessed that she actually knew. His baby was never stupid. Yi Muyun smiled, one hand still covering her eyes, the other already opened the brocade box, took out a plain white gold ring, took her hand, and slowly put it on. He did all of this without asking her if she could or not. He did it directly, just like how he usually did with her. Xuanru did not struggle. When that ice-cold ring appeared between her fingers, even a young girl like her felt a slight ripple in her heart. Baby, I'm proposing. He didn't let go of her eyes. He just held her little hand and whispered in her ear. Cher bit her lips and said in a flirtatious voice, You didn't beg me at all. There was a hint of accusation in his voice. Yi Muyun chuckled and let go of her eyes. He leaned sideways on the dining table and looked down at her. Baby, do you want me to beg you again? Under the dim light, a pair of figures appeared. Accompanied by the gentle piano music, it was extremely moving. Cher looked into his eyes and suddenly didn't want to struggle anymore. She slowly held his fingers and rested her little face on his knee. Just like that, they quietly and beautifully snuggled together. At this moment, she seemed to understand a lot. She understood his love, understood his long-term companionship, and understood his persistence towards her. Chapter 2029. Yi Muyun's gaze was deep. After a while, he took out a man's ring from his pocket. It seemed to be a pair with hers. He gently placed it in the palm of her hand, as solemnly as if he was handing over his life to her. Cher looked down at it for a while, then looked up at him before putting it on for him seriously. After she put it on, she said in a low and messy voice, You have to treat me better in the future. Don't bully me. Also, I'm afraid of pain. The little girl stood up and stood in the middle of his body. He was leaning against her, so they were much closer. As she said that, she tiptoed and kissed his chin. Finally, she moved to his lips and said in a low voice, Brother, are we going to be like this forever? It was rare for her to be enlightened, and she expressed her love for him. Yi Muyun's heart was boiling hot. It was an indescribable feeling. After a long time, he held her little face and deeply kissed her, kissing her until her little body softened in his arms, looking obedient. The kiss finally stopped, but he was still pecking at her little mouth. His voice was hoarse as he answered her question, I'll always be good to you. I'll bully you. Also, I'll be gentle at the beginning. His idiot wasn't stupid anymore. She teased him, You said you will bully me. You said you will be gentle at the beginning, but will you be very fierce later on? Her little hand hugged his arm as she said hatefully. As her brother, he coaxed her for a while, but he was also satisfied with teasing her like this. In the end, the candlelit dinner was all wasted. He carried her on the table and kissed her tenderly until she couldn't take it anymore. And the pianist had already left wisely. Tonight, He seemed to want to give her a beautiful memory. They didn't eat French food. He took her to eat skewers, but he didn't let her drink too much. He only gave her a small glass and he drank quite a lot. After drinking, he took off his coat and only wore a black shirt and casual pants of the same color. He was so handsome that the young ladies around him couldn't help but look at him. After looking at him, they blushed and their hearts raced. Cher drank some wine and felt uncomfortable. So, she sat on his lap and ate, enjoying her brother's care. Actually, it wasn't a good scene to see such a big girl sticking to someone, but when they were together, it was very pleasing to the eye. Of course, he knew that she was like this because she had been drinking. Usually, she would hide from him. However, he really liked the feeling of being cared for and liked by her. He allowed her to be like this, serving him carefully as though there was no one else around. When they left the barbecue restaurant, he was carrying her on his back. The little girl drank a little, so she acted coquettishly and acted cute, as if she had no legs. However, all of this was because she was jealous. Yi Muyun carried her on his back and walked outside for half an hour to sober her up. Then, he took her to play video games and watch a movie. He was very good at playing games. She looked at him with his jacket draped over her shoulders and asked him how long he had been playing. And this was Mr. Ye's answer. It was his first time. Cher deeply felt that her intelligence had been insulted. The people around her were all, she stood there obediently and pouted. "Brother, you won't have any friends like this?" He smiled and came down from above. He leaned against her and said, "I only need you." Chapter 2030. The impact of his words was too strong. Cher was still in a daze for a long time. She wanted to ask something, but he had already dragged her out of the arcade room. He wrapped his arms around her and walked forward. "Let's go watch a movie." In his arms, Cher bit her lip. "We didn't even manage to have a candlelit dinner. We played a few places. I'm so tired." He smiled and lowered his head to look at her. "You didn't have fun?" Cher shook her head and said gloomily, "No, I just felt that something was missing." At this moment, he had already reached the Ferris wheel in the amusement park. They were standing side by side. After that, the crowd seemed to have lessened. The lights on the Ferris wheel lit up instantly. It was as though this was the only place that existed in the world. The night breeze brushed past her little face and blew away the alcohol. Perhaps she had never been drunk tonight. She just wanted to be drunk for once in his arms. It wasn't that she wasn't happy. She just wanted to have more. And now he was going to give it to her? With the neon lights behind her and his clear eyes in front of her, Cher felt that the whole world was nothing more than this. "I don't know how other girls feel when they are proposed to, but I think that because you are my baby, my little yellow bun, it should be a little grander than others. Because others can't love you like I do." Yi Muyun said words that she had never heard before. Then he knelt down on one knee right in front of her. The stars and moon lost their color in an instant. He was holding his entire world in front of her. It should be his entire heart, his entire soul. He was finally giving it to her in its entirety. In this kind of night, just the two of them. He insisted that she should be the only one who knew about this. Cher lowered her gaze, her body trembling slightly. They had been together for so many years, but he had never once said that he loved her. She knew that he liked her, knew that he doted on her, knew that he was strict with her, but he didn't know that he loved her. She thought that he had already given her what she felt was missing. So, it wasn't that she didn't care. She cared a lot about this. "Cher, please let me give you everything." He opened his mouth slowly and lowered his head to kiss her white, slender finger that was wearing the engagement ring. He kissed it gently, even with a hint of humility. Between them, he had always been the weaker party, but she had never known. Never. She had only to stand there for him to come and stand beside her. Cher slowly placed herself in his arms and wrapped her fingers around his waist. Her voice was a little soft. "I only want you. I don't want anything. I don't want anything else." Because with him, there would be the whole world. Her words were the best words of love. Yi Muyun trembled as he kissed her. Under the Ferris wheel, he kissed her again and again. The huge Ferris wheel behind him rotated slowly, freezing time in this beautiful night. He kissed the love of his life in the night wind. In the end, they didn't watch the movie. He directly brought her to the presidential suite of the GM hotel. At the front desk, everyone saw that Mr. Yi had brought the little princess of the Tang family to the hotel. Everyone's hearts were a little, fuck. How old was Cher? There were still more than 10 days before her birthday. Was Mr. Yi going to start nibbling on her now? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.